Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint, Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I am delighted to be joined by Jeremy Thake, who will be talking to you about how to become more productive with the new Office 365 features. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC17. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have for Jeremy in the questions window. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will be notified by email when it is available. Don't forget to join us in Dublin, yes, from the 13th to the 16th of November 2017 for the European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Conference. Since so much happened at Ignite, our tickets are selling fast. So book today at sharepointeurope.com to avoid disappointment. And now I'm going to pass you over to the fantastic Jeremy Thake, our webinar presenter today. Hello, Jeremy.
Hi there, how are you?
I'm great. How are you today?
Good, thank you. We obviously wrapped up on Ignite, and it was pretty hard on us doing all the balancing, the juggling of trying to attend as many sessions as possible and represent in the expo hall for our own company, and then obviously catch up with everyone that's there to kind of understand what they think of all the news that's been announced last week.
Oh, brilliant. And Jeremy, you're no stranger to the European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Conference. What would you say to anyone who is thinking about going but just haven't sort of made up their mind yet?
Yeah, I think if you've missed Ignite, for sure, this is a no-brainer conference. You guys actually put on a really good job of selecting the correct balance of kind of Microsoft official speakers and also like MVPs and people that are experienced that are running these projects in big customers. And I think the main thing I love about this conference is it's kind of sharing real knowledge of how these technologies are used in the modern workplace. Whereas, sometimes when you get Microsoft guys on stage, because they're not actually implementing these things, it's hard for them to tell true stories without customers on stage. And so I think, going to this type of conference, it's a different edge on what you're used to from a Microsoft conference for sure. And I learn a lot more of people digesting all the news and giving their own opinion or saying how they implemented it in their own customer base than I do hearing it direct from Microsoft.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Jeremy, take it away.
Thank you. Can you see my screen? I think I need to share it still, don't I?
I think you need to click on share, yeah.
Yeah, let me just check. Let me know when you can see my screen. I'll leave my webcam up so you can see that I'm actually a human being and not some automated robot, because the way these Microsoft conferences go at the moment, it sounds like everything's been replaced by artificial intelligence.
Excellent. Well, I can see your screen there now, Jeremy.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Well, look, I really appreciate everyone attending this webinar this morning. I've put this together, and please excuse the scatterness of it, but it was really my take on what things were announced last week, which you can expect to roll out in Office 365 like today, all the way through to the next few months. And I've got some roadmap slides in there for a few of the products where they disclosed when things will be rolling out into Office 365. I was privy to some of these things prior to this because Hyperfish does have an NDA, and so now it's kind of nice to be able to share these things with other people. But some of these things came in extremely hot, and as someone that worked at Microsoft as a product manager in the Office 365 division, it was really exciting to see the amount of announcements around Office 365, and in particular things like SharePoint and Microsoft Teams, which were really the two most exciting kind of talked about things at all the expo and all the attendee parties and all of the attendee sessions as well. If you'd like to keep up with me after seeing this webinar, I actually do a 40-minute-ish podcast at blog.hyperfish.com where I talk to lots of people from around the world, including speakers, but more importantly, I've been getting customers on the podcast to talk about what works for them and what doesn't, and people see great value in that. I think to start with, the biggest change or the biggest thing that I thought was kind of added a lot of clarity to Office 365 was how they were starting to position things. I've written a blog post which I'm not proud of the fact that it's the most popular, because it is definitely kind of grabbing the search engine optimization in its entirety, where I talk about the SharePoint versus Microsoft Teams versus Office 365 groups versus Yammer. And Microsoft have always had this thing where, they've always got a few products that overlap and compare against each other. And it makes it hard as an end user to make a decision on, when do I use Yammer versus when do I use SharePoint versus when do I use the new Office 365 groups emails. And now they added Microsoft Teams to that loop back in November. And so the challenge for users is, not just when I make those decisions, but that confusion of how are other people making decisions on what they're using, so that if I'm new to a brand new team, how do I know where to go? And I did a podcast with Dan Holm, who's the director of SharePoint and OneDrive, who also owns Yammer, and he talked about this inner and outer loop. And he gave me a little bit of background that wasn't as part of the keynote and some of the sessions where you may have seen this slide pop up if you've been going on the Ignite website, which I'll talk about in a moment in terms of how you can get some of these slides. The way they position this is that Office 365 groups, and in all honesty, it's probably the worst name they could have ever chosen for this particular construct within Office 365, with all the history that with the name groups has, is really this notion of membership across applications in Office 365. But inside of Office 365, as I mentioned, there is Teams, there is Yammer, there is SharePoint, and there is Outlook groups in email. So you have the ability to create a group in Outlook that allows you to have a distribution list almost that's supersized, because you can get other things as part of that Office 365 group. So the decision being made really is, where do I collaborate? Where do I do things? And there's this notion that, in actual fact, the marketing team kind of said that this was come up with by Satya Nadella himself, the CEO of Microsoft, and was presented in an internal conference first, and it really got traction from the Microsoft field, who are really struggling with explaining this to customers of getting the most out of Office 365 and Microsoft 365, which is the broader kind of SKU that they're pushing really hard now. Just to explain it, the inner loop is essentially the people you work with regularly on core projects. So in my case, it would be my marketing team and my product management team, because I do the outbound messaging for Hyperfish with that team, and I assist with the product management with that team internally as well. That kind of work is very quick. It's very instant, and we expect, because that team is close to us, that they respond in a very quick manner. And that work often is private and shouldn't be shared with the organization, or the organization won't be able to give good information or be able to add any feedback into that. Whereas the outer loop is really about people being connected outside of the team that they genuinely work with day to day on projects that they share responsibility for, and is where we may go to reach a bit further afield to get feedback on things that we don't really know who they are out there, but they'll chime in. And so with this, what they're saying is that, look, there are different products that suit the inner and the outer loops. And it does make a lot of sense, and a lot of people that have explained this to customers have already been doing this, but maybe not with that terminology. And so I found this a really good take on the fact that, Teams is really right now being designed as a product, and strategically they're saying it's the inner loop of working with teams internally. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And Yammer, they've positioned it for a while now that it's this broad company-wide way, the Facebook of your organization, where you can post and other people can jump in and make comments, and it's open conversation, as opposed to Teams, which is much more private and closed conversation. And then email is something that's been around forever. It's never going to die. It'll always be there. And that can kind of bridge both the inner and the outer loop, and also the external kind of loop as well. So not just people across your organization, but people outside of your organization you communicate with. And then, interestingly, and this positioning became clearer at the virtual summit that they did at the beginning of the year for SharePoint, and I've got some slides on in here as well, where SharePoint is becoming much more of a focus on being a content service that these other products can consume and share inside of the work status that you're doing. And this will make more sense as I go through these slides. And so I found this really, really great slide by Sue Hanley, who is also a speaker at the European SharePoint Conference coming up as well. If you're not going, go just to see Sue speak. She works full-time on customer sites, and so everything that she does is very anecdotal to what she does with the customers in real life, and she's got a great way of articulating these things. And this was from a theatre session that she had, where it actually talked about this notion of the type of conversational mode you're in when it comes to collaborating with an example. And so I'm just going to kind of spell these out here and just kind of animate this whole thing out. But what you'll see is, and I think this is a great takeaway for anyone that's working and trying to understand, what's in the inner loop, what's in the outer loop, or what products and services you're going to be using. Especially now, it's very clear that Yammer is not going to die, and that it will sit inside Office 365 side by side with things like Microsoft Teams. And so if you look on this slide here, when you're kind of making decisions or you're doing group thinking, i.e., which sandwich shop should we order from for the department from now on, that kind of thing could go in a Microsoft team because you're in your department and you're making a decision. But it also could be in Yammer. Because of this notion is you might want opinions outside of your own department because other departments have made decisions on where they buy their sandwiches. Whereas, for instance, if I'm crowdsourcing anything about knowing about sandwiches, Yammer is definitely the right place to do that because my team might not be the subject matter expert on sandwiches, but posting on Yammer will definitely mean that anyone in the organization that sees that can chime in if they're an SME. And you can use things like topics and tags to make sure that those alerts come up for the right people that are the SMEs in sandwiches in this instance. And so I really like this slide and this particular session by Susan Hanley. In the download for this presentation, I'll make sure the links to all these slides where I've referenced them from, so you can kind of go and grab those from the Ignite website as well. And so this was the biggest kind of challenge I found coming into Ignite that people were confused with, and I think Microsoft did a great job of making sure that some of that was kind of overcome with slides like this, but also just with the way they're changing the strategy of some of these products. Now, from a SharePoint perspective, there was too much news for me to cover in one session from how this can make you productive. So I've picked my faves. There are a lot out there, and I know there are other sessions that are being done as webinars with the European SharePoint Conference, which will cover this in more detail. But the main breakouts were 2206 and the other ones by Naomi Moneypenny and Mark Cashman. And again, I'll put those in the links as well. And so the kind of positioning of SharePoint and OneDrive tweaked a little bit from the virtual conference, but just take note of the notion of intelligent content management and intranets. Now, when they positioned this at the virtual summit from a productivity perspective, it was very much focused on individual teams. And now they've really elevated this up to being that SharePoint can be used and should be used for company-wide intranets. And I think that's a big change, and it does mean that if you are considering doing an intranet project right now, that you really should be considering doing this on the modern sites inside of SharePoint. And so the biggest decision point you guys have to make now is how many of you are on Office 365 that can take advantage of modern sites? Because the week before Ignite, they announced that SharePoint Server, with the latest feature pack which will be deployed, will not support modern sites, and that you'll have to wait for the newly announced SharePoint 2019 to take advantage of modern sites. And it's partly to do with the fact that how to get those changes that were made in the cloud in SharePoint Online and moving those into SharePoint Server 2019. So if you want to take advantage of this new shiny stuff that's inside of SharePoint, you really do need to move on to SharePoint Online for the immediate future, because SharePoint 2019 won't be kind of released until mid next year. And so modern sites has got a lot of amazing things in it. There's a lot of it already available in your Office 365 tenants if you've got them. And so that was my major takeaway from this event from a SharePoint perspective, is that They're really focused on those two core areas of intelligent content management and intranets, but that this really is only going to be good for people that are in SharePoint in Office 365 and not on premises. So if you are thinking about upgrading to SharePoint Server 2016 and the cloud isn't an issue for you, or maybe it is a little bit, but you really want to show the value, I would highly considering the SharePoint Online scenario with Office 365 for this. Now, the pillars are similar from a productivity perspective, but I wanted to drive into one aspect of this that was interesting, is that they talked about from a productivity perspective that there was 3 key places to work. And I kind of like this from the aspect of, I always, when I'm talking to customers, find they're confused a little bit about where they should be working when it comes to documents-centric collaboration. Now, OneDrive for Business has been around for a long, long time, and it's evolved a lot. The sync has been questionable for a fair time, up until very recently. And I actually met Jeff Teeper after one of the sessions and had a good chat with him, and he was really pleased to hear that I'd switched off of using Dropbox and Amazon Drive for my own personal cloud storage over to OneDrive, because I finally, after doing a fair amount of testing parallel side by side for 3 months, was happy with how these things were going, but also getting way more benefits out of using OneDrive over Dropbox and Amazon Drive for the workflows I do with documents from a personal perspective. Now, these are all private by default, and I think the productivity tip for all my customers out there is that you've got to be really careful with what you're sharing when you're using your OneDrive for Business personal files, because it's very easy now with the new share tokens to make these things available to people and then forget, especially if you share folders with people. And so there are some great features in there to time bomb how long that sharing lasts for before you have to reshare that with an individual. And so rather than kind of sharing these things just by grabbing a link that will work for everybody, one of the features they did announce was this notion of being able to share not only with other people with Office 365 accounts or Microsoft accounts, which is their personal kind of identity that they'd use for Outlook.com, but now the demo that Dan Holm showed in Jeff Teeper's major keynote session was that you can actually share via email with anybody. So the demo he did was Gmail inbox receiving an email from OneDrive with a document link. He clicked on the document link and it asked them to validate that the email address was theirs. So Dan had shared it with jthake@gmail.com, and for me to validate that that link I've clicked on, it is actually coming from that inbox, it then sent me a code, and that code needed to copy and paste it into the first page I launched to validate that it's actually me. And so that locks the link I shared to that email address. And from a productivity perspective, that's huge, because it means that in the past where I shared a link around, I didn't really know who was opening that, because anyone with that link can open it without any validation. The biggest scenario that Dan used was, say I'm working with a contractor externally and I share a link to a document that's stored inside my OneDrive or one of my SharePoint team sites, was that by doing this, if that person leaves the organization, even though they could take the link with them, it wouldn't work, because the code to validate it's for that inbox email address would go to that inbox, which they no longer have access to because they wouldn't be with that organization as a contractor. And so I think that was, for me, is a huge productivity win, and it's super easy to do. I'd love to show you, but unfortunately it's not quite across all the tenants yet. But it's a big area that they've worked on, is this notion of making it easier to share the documents with people for having full trust of where they're going. And I think this promotion of going from being in this personal space where I'm working on files on my own to moving to this team site thing is still challenging for people. And I had a lot of discussions this week with large customers that have a user base that weren't comfortable with even starting in OneDrive or SharePoint. And my big take from a productivity perspective that I learned this week in helping people to overcome this thing of storing it on your C drive and not being comfortable into it as a 100% perfect document to move into, having it in the cloud and being able to share it with other people. And the tip that I got from a few people consistently, which was kind of nice to hear, was talk about the benefits of having it in OneDrive or having it in SharePoint. And there was definitely a lot of resistance from the average user of putting it somewhere where it shows up in Delve or putting it somewhere where it now shows up in search. And so it was clear that it was just an educational thing to all of your users in your organization that OneDrive is private. So if I put my document in OneDrive, it isn't available to anybody else. It's only available to me. But the difference is it's available to me wherever I am and whatever device I'm on. So, for instance, I'm sitting in my home office here. I've built myself a PC and it sits under my desk. It isn't a mobile device. And so when I go to the Hyperfish offices later on and I turn on my laptop, I know because I've worked on this presentation on OneDrive on this machine that when I turn my laptop on and it syncs, I can actually get to that document without needing my desktop PC. And I think the catch that I find is that I've been around technology for a long time, and I always think that everyone works and knows all the features that I know. And I think sometimes we need to step back and reflect on the fact that not everyone knows the features of OneDrive or Dropbox or Amazon Drive or Google Drive, and just to remind them of what that product gives them as a benefit. And it's not just the ability to jump and roam on different devices and see that document. It's versioning of those documents as well. And the ability then to securely share it with other people via email, via Microsoft Teams, via Yammer, via SMS, wherever you want to share it with. It makes it super easy, and it goes to that document and not to a copy of the document, which is obviously what happens with attachments. And so for me, that was a really big deal in the aspects of understanding this notion of trying to push more and more people to use OneDrive. And everyone at Microsoft was extremely excited to show Files on Demand again, which will be part of Windows 10 update coming up shortly. And what that means is that, we will be able to upload a document inside of the cloud, but then I can have that folder locally on my machine, but I don't need to pull the whole thing down. So for instance, in my environment, I have over 1 terabyte of files in my OneDrive, but I don't want to pull that down onto my nice, responsive, fast SSD drive that I have in my MacBook Pro. And so I want to be able to select what things get pulled down on demand onto that machine. And it might be different to what I have on my main desktop machine because I've got larger hard drives in here. And so what it means is that I have all of my documents on the go, including file previews and all the file names and the folder structures. And what it means is, and I think this is the big takeaway and will increase the adoption of files inside of SharePoint, is that because of Files on Demand, you can have your users work how they work forever, which is they have a file explorer. Typically, they're working on their C drive. Just get them to change to working inside of their OneDrive personal folder, which is private by default, or they work inside of one of the folders of the SharePoint sites they work with their teams. And so that was a really big kind of, I know it's been talked about a lot, but they've really started to understand that challenge at Microsoft, and add features that really help with that. And so the big positioning, based on this kind of push of get your documents in here from a files perspective, was they were really talking more, in my opinion, about SharePoint being a content service across all of Office 365, whether you're in Outlook, Teams, Yammer, or Planner, and that regardless of what you use, SharePoint wins because everything that they do around files is going to be backed by a SharePoint team site, because when you create one of those areas on the screen, you're actually creating an Office 365 group, which also in the background creates a modern SharePoint team site. So regardless of whether you pick SharePoint to be your presentation layer for the team collaboration you're using, you're going to get a SharePoint team site and be able to leverage not just files, but lists, pages, and news. And so this was a big kind of strategy of SharePoint's to be kind of this viral thing that is in all of the parts of Office 365. So that Outlook or Teams or Yammer, and Yammer was probably the worst offender of this in the fact that it had its own file system because it was an acquisition from external part of Microsoft. And so now, this is where SharePoint has carved out what it owns within Office 365. And this really does prove that, one, SharePoint isn't dead, but two, that it's playing a big role inside of Office 365 as well. They did demo a lot of this from a productivity perspective inside of the communication sites, and there was a great breakout, the 2393, that talks about the new features that are available to brand your site with the logos that we've been familiar with in SharePoint for a long time, but the navigation as well, not just in the site navigation, but in this notion of hub sites, which I'll show in a moment. And I think where Microsoft are going here is that they're treading on this fine line of wanting users to be able to do whatever they want with the site and make it not look like SharePoint. But then they also don't want to be in this mess where when they do the upgrade of SharePoint to the next thing, that it doesn't mean that sites are going to break when they do the upgrade. And so they're keeping us on rails, but they're making the sites look beautiful. And if I was a betting man right now, I'd be investing in a few stock photography websites because these things will only look beautiful if you have decent photos. And most people don't have access to some of these hot air balloon things and men standing on tips of cliffs like Microsoft do. And so that's going to be a big issue in that sense. So get your creative hats on when you start creating these comm sites with my feeling here. But from a productivity perspective, what does this mean? Well, I think that this is going to be a great way, and Mark Cashman positioned it like this when I interviewed him on my podcast way back in March, and it was really cemented in this one, which was, in the past, when you were sharing news, you may have gone to email to do this, and written out an email and said, this is all the company news. And for instance, Hyperfish is doing this right now, where each of us is sharing our own opinions of how successful a conference it was for Hyperfish and the features that we announced. And so, for instance, I can share these things. CJ, who is our CTO, who you probably know from the Microsoft Cloud show, shared an email yesterday with his write-up of all the things that he thought about the success of the event for us at Ignite. Now, from my perspective, the email was good, and it was text, and it had a little bit of styling with bolding and so forth, but it didn't really allow me to get a good impression of what was going on. Now, with communication sites, I have the ability to create a news page that can be way more visual, can embed PowerPoint docs, can embed photos. Maybe I want to embed a photo of the booth. I can embed photos of quotes from people, like you can see at the bottom of this page here. And so it's really nice visual experience for me to scroll through and share my opinion. And sure, I could have done it as a PowerPoint deck and shared the PowerPoint deck around. But with these communication sites as pages, they're a lot quicker to put together than a PowerPoint, in my opinion, and that they read nice both on a browser and in a desktop machine. And also because you can comment on these things as well. And that was the biggest thing from a collaboration perspective I thought was announced with Yammer's strategy, was that now with these news pages inside of SharePoint, I can actually have comments that come from Yammer. That means I can have a discussion around the things I'm sharing. And so that was a big deal for me in that aspect, was that now communication sites makes more sense, and it's not just about department news. I can build these stories that I can share with people and then have conversations with them with the Yammer Embed web part that I couldn't do before. And so that's really nice, I think, to, again, have this productivity decision of, do I use email to share my news? Do I post it in Yammer? Do I post it on Teams? Or maybe if I want it to be really visual and make a big impact in the company and impress my peers and impress my managers with how nice that report looks, that these news sites is definitely a great way to do that and increase kind of how we work inside our organization. So that was exciting to see the evolution there. And they even showed this notion of, when I've got a SharePoint site that isn't a communication site, of how much more non-SharePoint it looks and more visually appealing it looks, and also how it's powered by the Office Graph. I've done a podcast in the past and a blog post on this where I've been hearing a lot of people turning off the Office Graph, mainly for the fear that the executives in the company are worried that their documents have been discovered that shouldn't be discovered. My feedback here is Delve is not your problem, nor is the Office Graph. Your security is the problem on who's sharing what, where, and where documents are being stored, and what the visibility of those things are. Because search and the graph will only show you things that you have access to. And so don't turn the Office Graph off is my strongest bit of advice, because there are so many things that were announced this week that simply will not work in Office 365 without the Office Graph being on. So if you're getting pushback on Delve, being a concern, or from a search perspective because it's kind of bubbling documents up to the surface that they don't want people seeing, I would look at the core root problem, which is the security of your documents, and fix that, rather than just kind of chopping the head of the Medusa off and then the head growing back straight away, which is what you're basically doing by turning the Office Graph off, and it means you're also not taking advantage of some of these nice features like activity and what's working, who's working on what around you. So that's kind of been a big deal. The Office Graph is bubbling up everywhere inside of that. And then a few other quick bits on SharePoint. The site usage has become even more meaningful in terms of what content is trending, most viewed, and what's had the most unique viewers. As a site owner, this is awesome, because as a productivity perspective, it means that I can now start to understand what's working, what isn't, in the site that I own, the pages that I own, whether I'm using it as a document library inside of Microsoft Teams area, or whether I'm using this as an intranet for a division or a department or even a company-wide one. And so definitely kind of start to understand the benefits of using these site analytics aspects to learn how your users have been productive and what can be changed. And I think, again, these things are much more rich inside of SharePoint Online than they are in SharePoint Server. And then Jeff Teeper pushed really hard on the mobile apps. I have been using these for a while, and they have got a lot better to be productive and on the go. There are some really nice features that have been introduced as part of that. There was a session that was dedicated to this if you're interested in that kind of the mobile strategy around SharePoint. So I'm not going to go about SharePoint all the time because we've already burnt through a fair amount of time on this. But I couldn't go past without showing you this, which is they're integrating very heavily now with Power Apps and Microsoft Flow. And what you'll see from this screenshot now is that they have the ability to understand that there are files that need your attention, whether it's that they're in draft and need approving, or whether they need to be reviewed. And so this is a really nice kind of bringing together of different groups within Microsoft to make this product sing. And it's something that we've all done manually in SharePoint for a long, long time with additional site columns that is now something that is kind of really being understood as a workflow out of the box. So definitely a big thing to see there. The Administration Center got a new beefy new UI that's going to take a little bit of a while to get all the old settings across, but will make a big difference. And then I did already mention the hub sites, but I just wanted to show you a quick screenshot, which was that now what you can do is you can group sites together and have a common navigation over a group of sites. So they've called those hub sites. And so, for instance, HR might have a travel site, it might have an expenses site, it might have a policy site, and then it'll have a core HR site. Well, you can now group those things together in a hub site and get this top-level navigation across everything, as well as this sub-site navigation for each individual site. Big deal. We've always done this with master pages and page layouts and hacking the hell out of things, and now they've put this out of the box. It works across mobile and the web browser as well, and I think they make a big difference for cross-site navigation that is kind of by default, which means that when they update things in SharePoint, it's not going to break any kind of hacky things you've done inside of it. So they've already started to listen in that angle. Okay, so SharePoint was probably, for me, the most exciting. It was close to me thinking that was just a SharePoint conference. They obviously announced that there's going to be a SharePoint conference in Vegas next year, dedicated to SharePoint, so they're going to be sponsoring that, which is a privately run event. But the other big thing is that Power Apps is now getting even more deep dived into SharePoint. And so now we have the ability to, from a SharePoint list or library, launch and create a Power App that acts as kind of this presentation layer on top of the information that's stored in SharePoint. And it can auto-generate apps really, really quickly, and then you can share them very quickly. I see this definitely as not a replacement of InfoPath and SharePoint Designer in that way, but it's just a new way of working that's very mobile orientated, that has a good desktop experience as well, and has a nice web experience. But what's coming in October, which they kind of talked about in the beginning of the year as well, that'll really help from a productivity perspective, is that Power Apps can now sit in this kind of like side panel on the right-hand side from the context of a list or library. And so if you haven't explored Power Apps yet, I'd really encourage you to check out Power Apps of building these more visual ways of collecting data entry inside a SharePoint list or library. And then the other aspect is that if you're working with SharePoint Designer workflows at the minute and you haven't checked out Microsoft Flow, they have really stepped their game up in terms of being able to trigger Microsoft flows from a list or library, but also be able to create them very easily as well. And there's some great recipes out of the box there too. But the thing they announced this week that was really impressive was that now the out-of-the-box content approval is based on Microsoft Flow, and that'll be available in October. And so the ability to kind of, inside of your list or library, be able to do an approval with your typing your notes and never leave SharePoint. Also go into Microsoft Flow and see all the documents that you need to approve in one place and approve them. So there's been a lot of work on this productivity, which is really impressive. So obviously Office 365 groups from a productivity perspective, as we mentioned at the beginning with this inner and outer loop, is definitely a productivity decision you have to make. And as I mentioned, Outlook is really about email and calendaring, and there's a defocus on calendars and SharePoint lists now, and that if you do anything with calendars, it should really be in Outlook. We talked about intranets and content management in SharePoint, and we talked about Yammer being this connecting across the organization type communication aspect. And this beautiful Office client, whether I'm in the web, mobile, or desktop, co-authoring documents is within the Office apps. And that Teams is really about that hub for teamwork inside your inner loop. Now, the Office 365 groups messaging has kind of been like this for a while. They've just really kind of sharpened it there from a decision-making process of when you use what where. But they did announce quite a few things from a productivity perspective around expirations of groups, around soft deleting and restoring of groups, and also reporting on groups to see the total number of groups, how many active groups there are, and activity across groups, across the workloads, whether it's inside of Yammer, Teams, or SharePoint, and so forth. And so there's been some big additions there that I think are really important for people to understand that, this is the foundations of Office 365, that all those services that you consume use on. But there are benefits of kind of really understanding how you can manage those things as a kind of an owner of Office 365 as well. Now, there was tons and tons of Microsoft Teams sessions this week, or last week even, and I think it broke boundaries in terms of the hashtag mentions on Twitter with all the news. Fundamentally, the biggest news is that over time, the Microsoft Teams client will replace the Skype for Business client. There are quite a few feature gaps right now, but this week they announced a significant amount of narrowing those gaps around Skype for Business, including the ability for me to dial into a group call that's happened inside of a Microsoft Team channel, which wasn't there prior to Ignite. And so this really allows me now that if I've got a team that I'm working with day to day, we're still transitioning at Hyperfish to Teams. We've got Slack for our developer channels, and so we don't really want to be in two places, so we're waiting for some things to be in Teams before we can move. But this ability of being able to have a text conversation with people and, have emojis and posting images and attachments and documents, but then just, needing to speak to people and be able to see their face, is this ability to now easily start a video call from your conversation you're having in Teams, but then having people be able to dial in if they've not got their computer in front of them or they're on the road. And so this was really useful from that aspect. And they've positioned Teams as this ability to have this unified productivity experience with integration capabilities that go further than just what services are available in Office 365. And I think what made me laugh when I saw this presentation was that if you roll back the clock 6 years, you could have replaced Microsoft Teams with SharePoint. And so it's a journey the Microsoft Teams team are going on where they think they're reinventing, the modern workplace, and this hasn't all been done before. I think they've got a very strong case for this, and I think that's why you'll see that SharePoint is saying that there are content services in the intranet, and that Microsoft Teams is very much more about kind of private collaborating groups, whereas Yammer is more open collaboration in groups. But the strength that they had in some things that were demonstrated was that now there's even more tabs that are available to kind of bring in other services into your Microsoft Teams. So it's not just about chat, voice, and video. It's about bringing in those services from other areas. And just as an example of that, I have open a Microsoft Teams there, and if I just show you the browser window, this is a demo environment. I can just go and create a team here. I'm just going to call this ESPC. I'm going to have that as private, and that's going to go away and create that team. And what's really interesting is, I'm prompted. I can add members. If I could spell Brian correctly, I would add Brian, because we've got a few Brians in here. So I'm just going to add those, and that would have sent invites to Brian via email to join that. And so you can see here I can have my usual conversations. I can mention people in here to have that conversation. But the nice part about this is that I have this notion of tabs. And so by default, when I go in the Files tab, that's going to be using a OneDrive location for me to be able to drag and drop files into here. And I can then have those shared with my team and reference those. And just grabbed a file off my desktop there. And you can see it's uploading that. And that's going to be uploading that into OneDrive. So Teams doesn't have its own file share. So what it means is the things that your users are used to in OneDrive will now work inside of Teams. So I have the ability that I can go and grab that link, and then what I can do, if I copy that link in, is I can actually be like, can you please approve, can you please review, and paste that in, and you'll see that those URLs aren't that great. But I can also do things like I can attach from here, and I can show from recent, and it's going to be using the graph, which is not quite cached yet for that file I just uploaded, where I can pick that file as well. And so it just allows me really quickly to come in and see those files and collaborate with them and comment and mark them up as we choose. So the workflow is really nice in that aspect. And what they announced that was new is they've added a few more tabs in here for me to create new things. So for instance, I can now come in and pick from sites I've got inside my environment, or just grab the URL for a list or library. And one thing they announced, which isn't quite in here yet, is that I can now add a SharePoint page, like a communication site, as a tab in here. So my users don't have to leave Teams. And I think this is where people get torn, because from a productivity perspective, I live in Outlook all day long. I would have liked to have seen this kind of extensibility in tabs in Outlook, rather than this pivot on Microsoft Teams being about chat and having tabs in here. I think that's really where, from a productivity perspective within your organization, you're going to have to make a decision on whether you do it in Outlook as your core, whether you do it as Teams as your core, or whether your intranet pages are as a core as well. And maybe that different people in your org work differently, and you just have to be comfortable with that and make sure that things are serviced in all those areas. It just makes it more complicated as an owner of the workplace in your organization. And then the other core part was that they really worked hard on the mobile aspect of Microsoft Teams as well. And so with this notion of not just chat, but the ability to launch tabs and actually have custom things going on there as well. And myself and Richard Desariga did a session on enterprise bots that took it even further, and not only had personal conversations with people, but also had group social conversations with people in Microsoft Teams. So definitely check that session out from Friday morning if you get a chance and you're interested in how bots can help you as well. And Teams is definitely the place to go for bots from a productivity perspective. But one thing to bear in mind is that the demo that myself and Richard showed in our session embedded the bot in the page of SharePoint. So you didn't have to come to Teams to talk to the bot. The bot was actually just added as a web part in a site in SharePoint, and this was really useful for the scenario that we were demonstrating around kind of talking to users where they live inside their intranet, rather than making them come to a Microsoft Teams to have that conversation. So bots and this mobile story is very strong. Okay, so a quick touch on Stream from a productivity perspective. They added a lot of new features just to kind of really make it easier for users to be more productive in sharing videos. And so part of that is that you can store things in YouTube by default, but for instance, when I come into Stream, this is almost like my private enterprise YouTube, and I think a lot of people don't realize the value this gives as part of the Office 365 subscription. There are some SKUs you have to be aware of if you want to take advantage of some of the more advanced features like transcribing of videos. But it's a really nice way of being able to share videos inside of your organization and have channels that only certain people can see, to be able to share things like screen recordings of meetings, or even share videos that you've done to give updates of things within your organization. Maybe you don't want to write things down, you just want people to watch a video instead. So I just highlight that a lot of people seem to forget about Microsoft Stream as a productivity thing. I think it's really important that people understand that video is a big way people consume things, like the fact you're on this webinar right now. Okay, so the big thing for me that I was interested in seeing how Microsoft positioned this week was obviously Microsoft announced LinkedIn acquisition a while back now, and how that's going to impact users from a productivity perspective. Obviously, for us at Hyperfish, we're really focused on making sure that all of your profiles are complete and up to date, and we use bots to help people update their profile information so it looks pretty across everywhere. And LinkedIn obviously has the value of LinkedIn is that it also has profile information about lots and lots of users across the world. And what we're finding is that people information is really at the center of everything that happens now inside the user experience, whether you're in Microsoft Teams or Outlook or Skype, Delve or SharePoint, Flow. And so Microsoft are making sure that not only are they showing now information that is inside the organization from Active Directory and SharePoint user profiles, but that they're also showing things outside of their organization as well. And so to date, this is where you see information, whether it's in contact cards or Teams org charts or inside of Delve, or even in these new pop-up contact cards that show up inside of OneDrive and Outlook and SharePoint. But what Microsoft shared is that they've had this notion of graphs in both companies, in both LinkedIn and Microsoft, and they wanted to get in a way of understanding that there is this link between Jeremy Thake in the Microsoft Office 365 environment and Jeremy Thake as in LinkedIn as well, and how we can start getting a bit more of an insight into connecting those things together. And so what they announced this week is that they are working on this ability to not increase the people experience inside of Office 365 with the work they've been doing around contact cards in the different services, and adding this LinkedIn tab. Now, if you've been following along with this, there have been a lot of privacy concerns in the sense that LinkedIn is my personal information that I provide to LinkedIn. Active Directory is owned by my organization, and typically the organization, for most organizations, puts the information in there. Obviously, with what Hyperfish does, we make that easier for users to provide more information for AD as well. And so the kind of the grey area is that, well, the organization can't just dip into my LinkedIn profile without asking my permission, and LinkedIn shouldn't go and do that on the organization's behalf. And so as part of this experience, you as a user will have to come in here on the first time you launch that LinkedIn tab and actually consent to giving LinkedIn those permissions. And what you'll get from this is a few things. You will see, with the first release, you'll see the experience that user has had in their contact card of different work experience in their own company, but also in external companies as well, and also their education. So this information, for some of the organizations that we work with, they're actually storing this already in their own Active Directory, But with LinkedIn, this is not just good for your internal employees, it's really good for your external users that you communicate with. So in email, I could click on Courtney Rees and see this information without kind of having to go and copy-paste Courtney Rees and go into LinkedIn and paste it and find out who she is. Now, if you've used Zobni in the past, which is inbox spelt backwards, there was a product that did this quite a while ago, and then LinkedIn actually had an add-in that did this that we, when I was in Microsoft, promoted heavily because it was a great use of an Outlook add-in. But this is really now just built in across the people experience that's been rolled out across all of Office 365. And so this is kind of where the LinkedIn integration is going in the next 6 to 12 months. And it's really about servicing information from LinkedIn. But the key here is it's opt-in. You have to consent as an Office 365 user for your Office 365 user to be able to call into LinkedIn using your LinkedIn identity to get this information through. Right, and so I'm going to be interested to follow on here from a productivity perspective. I think this is super useful, and people in that breakout that I went to that talks about this were really excited about the ability to see this amount of information. Personally, it surprised me that there wasn't more information on there. For instance, they're not showing endorsed skills on here. They're not showing a variety of different things of like group membership that people are at in LinkedIn, for instance. This is about as far as they're going to start with. This is not rolling out to all first release customers. It's going to a select group of first release customers. And so they're really treading the water gently on how they introduce this LinkedIn integration. But it's going to be there very shortly. But as I say, it's opt-in for users. But the other interesting thing is that the information that's opted in by the users is not going to be shared with other people in the organization. So just because one person opts in on LinkedIn right now doesn't mean that they're going to start crawling that and then sharing that information with other people in your organization. It's really only for your eyes when you do that consent. And then if the Office 365 admin is uncomfortable with this, maybe there's a policy internally that doesn't allow for this in the company, there are giant switches to turn this stuff off inside of Office 365, so they've heard that loud and clear. And then the other additional thing is if you're leaving the organization, there are giant switches for the individual to, after you've opted in, maybe opt out later on. So they've done a really good job of understanding privacy and control up front with this. And I think part of this is probably due to the acquisition and some kind of legal agreements I had to do here, but they've worked really hard to be very clear on, we get it, there are concerns here, we understand that this is if we did everything we wanted to do, we'd probably be evil. And we don't want to be evil, borrowing the Google motto. And so we've added all this privacy and control in place right from the offset. So definitely something worth keeping an eye on from a personal search experience perspective with LinkedIn. And then lastly, before we go Q&A, I think the most exciting thing other than all the SharePoint announcements, and this is a little bit related to SharePoint because it's from the same division of Microsoft in terms of reporting structure, is that search is becoming extremely personal across Office 365. Whether I'm in Office.com, SharePoint, I'm actually in the Office apps, I'm inside of Bing Enterprise now, which they're talking about, or even in Windows. The Office or the Microsoft Graph is now powering all those experiences, and I'm getting the learnings of wherever I do this and the relevance across all those experiences. So gone are the days where I go into Outlook and search for emails, and I go into SharePoint and I search for files, and I go into Teams and search for conversations. Search is search, and wherever you see a search box in the future, it'll be able to go across all the content that you have within your own personal work environment inside Office 365. And I think it's been a big challenge to get this to work. As someone who worked in Microsoft, it's hard to get things like the people experience and the search experience across all products. But I think they've done a really good job here with this. They talked about it in 3 ways. They talked about it where it's kind of like boundaryless across your organization, network and beyond. They talked about it from a personalized perspective where essentially it knows what you're looking at, it knows who you are, it knows who you work with. And so when you start typing things in, it recommends results based on that very personalized aspect. But then also contextualized in the sense that it knows what you're doing and where you're doing it. So if I'm in Teams and I'm doing searches, that maybe it bubbles up my conversations before it bubbles up my Yammer conversations, for instance. And so there's some real smarts around how this search stuff works. And it's learning using the Microsoft Graph. And you'll notice there that Bing and LinkedIn are in there too. But it'll start getting even more intelligent about you as an individual inside of Office 365 and what you do. And again, privacy controls in place by default will mean it won't do things it shouldn't do. And it's all about your personal experience. This is not something the organization can take advantage of. And so as I mentioned, this comes across all of the experiences and incorporates all the content that you store inside of Office 365. And it has had a makeover. So right now there's this like kind of weird juggle we're doing where we're using kind of like Delve as one place to search, which seems to cover everything, and then a SharePoint site collection, which is a search center, as the other. This is really replacing all those things and allowing me to have a much better experience where I can expand these cards and have document previews and see the metadata and quickly have faceted searches and have the ability to drive down on different types of content like site people, files, and news. And so I think this is a big step for discoverability within Office 365 from a productivity perspective that they talked about. And Naomi Moneypenny had a very good session on this that went into detail not only on document searching but also on people searching as well. So just to quickly wrap up for our Q&A, one of the other big announcements we had here was that Hyperfish announced a free product. So if you're seeing lots of silhouettes inside of your Office 365 environment rather than real people, help Hyperfish bring your directory to life by running our Hyperfish Lite product. We help basically by scanning your directory and understanding who's missing photos, and then our bot reaches out and asks them to update their photo, and then we push that to all the right places in Office 365. So I'm hoping that helped today. I will take any questions in the Q&A, and I will just quickly go back to my main title slide. So I'm going to jump into the Q&A here, and maybe I'll just make my share screen just big here. There you go.
Do you want me to run some questions by you, Jeremy?
If you've got any there, Shane, that'd be awesome.
Great. Okay, so we have loads, so I'll get to these as quick as I can. In Office 365, not everything is modern, e.g. document sets, task lists, agenda lists. Do you know when everything will be modernized so that our new users will have to learn and adapt to one interface?
Yeah, good question. So for some of those things, they won't become modern because they're on other services in Office 365. So for instance, tasks lists, for instance. Planner is really the future of tasks within Office 365. And so I wouldn't see them doing too much work on that task list or the calendar list because calendars is really inside of Outlook. And when you create an Office 365 group, you get a planner and you get an Outlook shared calendar. And so, what will happen is that there will be a calendar web part that is servicing from Outlook calendar and a tasks web part that's serviced from Planner. So that's where I see the modern experience of SharePoint kind of moving more towards this notion of leveraging the services that are best of breed in Office 365 and SharePoint kind of trimming off some of its excess baggage that isn't core to what they're doing right now.
Okay. About team sites.
Yeah, they did announce, what did they announce? They announced some modern site stuff in there for a few of those services actually to be new web parts that are integrated with SharePoint.
Okay. About team sites, communication sites, is it expected that private public groups will be abandoned?
Private? No, they were very clear that there's different scenarios for when you would use private and public. I think the reading between the lines is they're trying to make kind of Yammer be the fully public open, Microsoft Teams being kind of the smaller private team communications, and SharePoint kind of being that content service under the hood. But yeah, that's still going to be something that security-wise you're going to need private and public for sure.
Okay. What is the difference between an Office 365 group and a SharePoint team site?
the diagram that I showed that essentially had the Office 365 groups at the bottom, and then showed all the services as pillars on the top. Treat an Office 365 group essentially as a way of provisioning membership, and then the products on top are provisioned as part of that membership. Now, the smart part, what they did is they said, look, rather than Microsoft Teams have its own way of doing security and membership, and Yammer having its own way of security and membership, and SharePoint having its own way of doing security and membership, let's have a common way of doing membership across all products in Office 365, and then that way my user doesn't have to learn the differences. And so they're still kind of cleaning up a lot of how products used to do security. Like Yammer now supports Office 365 groups, and SharePoint is kind of getting there because they had their own SharePoint site collection groups and different ways of doing SharePoint groups inside of team sites. But ultimately, they're all going towards getting this membership that's only managed by Office 365 groups.
Okay. How do all these new sites tie in with the existing sites we have in terms of governance and planning? It seems like a recipe for a proliferation of too many sites. We already have an unwanted site collection for our Yammer groups.
Yeah, and Microsoft got clobbered with this a fair bit. Now we've got thousands of Yammer groups, we've got thousands of Microsoft Teams groups, we've got thousands of SharePoint groups. We're going to have all these thousands of communication sites as well. They're putting in a lot of place from a governance perspective out of the box to understand which ones are active and which ones aren't. There was a session which I'll put in the show notes, and it escapes me who is Martina Grom, actually, who's an MVP based out in Europe, who I believe is speaking at a show too. And she did a governance session which kind of went into real detail about this notion of the concern of Office 365 groups and getting out of control, and SharePoint groups and getting out of control, and some of the things that she's worked on with customers to almost have like provisioning workflows with approvals. So I want a group, and I don't want my users to automatically be able to create them, but have a almost like a gate check in the middle of this that kind of can approve those things before they get provisioned inside of Office 365 to kind of control the sprawl. If you talk to people at Microsoft, they kind of like embrace it. It is the world, storage, it doesn't matter. The world of having a taxonomy of sites rather than just kind of letting everyone create their own things is not a problem. I see both sides of that story. And so Martina Grom's session was very good, and Sue Hanley also has a good session that covers this stuff too.
Okay. Some quick ones. Are we going to be able to tag videos in Stream?
So there is tagging in terms of channels right now, but that tagging isn't kind of across the whole of Office 365. So they did announce last week that now Stream is becoming a first-party citizen of Teams and SharePoint, so that when I create an Office 365 group and it creates a SharePoint site and it creates a Stream channel for me, and so that when I embed a Stream web part into SharePoint, it kind of knows that's where the videos are going to be. It does do, if you have the paid edition of Stream, you get like a 60-day trial as part of Office 365. It will do those translation and transcription services for you, the videos. And so when you do searching, it'll search the content of the voice of those videos, which is really, really neat. There is this kind of talk of this tagging happening across all of Office 365, but there wasn't much chat around that at this conference. So that'll be interesting because there's a lot of products that have this notion of tagging. There doesn't seem to be an all Office 365 answer for that yet.
Okay. And there's one last question, Jeremy, I just have to ask. What is the real future of Yammer?
So in the podcast that Dan Holm did with me, which is on blog.hyperfish.com, he talked at length at this. So if you're really interested in that, I would highly recommend doing that. And Angus Florence had a session last week that went into a lot of detail. But my kind of, non-Microsofty, unofficial kind of take on this is that, I thought Yammer was dying on the vine for a long time. Microsoft Teams kind of came along, and I was like, oh, that's surefire, it's done now. But with the way that they're positioning the inner and the outer loop, the way that they're saying that Teams is much more for the inner loop, Yammer's more for the open loop. And I've questioned it, and I've blogged about this in the sense that Well, but Teams can be an open group as well. And sure, it can only support 1,000 users in a team, and it can be public, whereas Yammer can go to the whole organization and be public. But for many small organizations, that size cap doesn't matter. And in some cases, Teams is better than Yammer in the way that the experience works because of the tabs and because of the way the chat is more kind of real-time than it is with Yammer. But with the direction that Yammer are going on really being known as that, and Teams really being told almost you can't go near that scenario of the outer loop, and also with the way that now you can embed Yammer as a conversations directly into SharePoint pages now, which if you remember back at the SharePoint Virtual Summit, that wasn't the case. Yammer is back, and I think the fact now that Dan Holm is responsible for it from a product management perspective, and he owns SharePoint and OneDrive, that integration story between SharePoint, OneDrive, and Yammer will get very strong. And much like the Microsoft Teams Plus, SharePoint and OneDrive is strong, but it's very much around that open discussion and knowing things you wouldn't think to know, or knowing people and discovering people that you don't actively go looking for, but they're going to come find you because of that you're talking in the open, in that outer loop. And so, there is definitely been a question thing for a long, long time, much like people question whether SharePoint was dying or not. But I do believe with the direction it's going in that Yammer is here to stay because of what I just explained.
Great. There is more questions, but we're sadly out of time. Jeremy, you will pass me on the presentation and I can share it with everyone that's attended?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great.
And
so
in the notes for the slides, I've referenced what sessions those slides were poached from, just to give them credit, because this was a grab bag of things from Ignite, and hopefully you get value out of that.
Brilliant. Okay, and I will be sharing this presentation with everyone that's registered, so they'll be able to forward it on to colleagues and various different things. Jeremy, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. Really appreciate it on behalf of the community here at the European SharePoint, Office 365 and Azure community.
No, you're welcome, and thanks for everyone for listening and for the questions.
Great. Okay, everybody, that's pretty much it for today. Join us for our next Ignite Roundup tomorrow, Wednesday, October 4th, 2017, from 1 to 2 p.m. CEST, when we will learn the latest on SharePoint development from Product Group, Patterns, Models, Roadmap, with Vesa Juvonen, Senior Program Manager at OneDrive. Thank you all for attending. Have a great day.